Welcome to our Creating a Wildlife Friendly Garden video. My name's Jeremy. I'm one of the education officers from Green Adelaide. In this video, we'll run through some of the key things that you need to consider when creating a wildlife friendly garden. To get us started, I'll hand over to my colleague Rob.
What are we trying to do when we create a wildlife friendly garden? Well, we're trying to create a mini ecosystem that provides habitat for a whole range of animals. Everything from the creepy crawlies and lizards through to bats and possums. So what are we doing when we create habitat for animals? Well, we're providing for three things basically. Protection from the weather for animals and also protection from other animals that might attack them. We're also providing sources of food for those animals. And last of all, we're providing a safe place for breeding and raising the young. Here's my front garden. It's a mini ecosystem in the making. It's not very big, but it links to other bits of vegetation, as you can see. And I already get lots of things in: birds, lots of mini beasts like wolf spiders, hoverflies, native bees. So layers are important for animals. And I've tried to have a few different layers here. We've got the hop bush in front of me, which will grow to a couple of metres. We've got the trees behind, but equally important are the grasses and the ground covers for the creepy crawlies and lizards and things like that. So now we might look at layers with a bit more detail. We need to create a range of densities in our garden to cater for different animals' needs. We need to have a canopy of trees that's not too dense with some space between it. We also need groups of shrubs for some animals, but also single shrubs for other animals. And we need bare ground and ground cover and grasses as well. We need to have a range of plants that flower at different times of the year and provide things like fruit, nectar and seed for different animals. When selecting your plants, it's important to use local native plants because they're more likely to cater for the needs of local native animals. It's important, especially if you've got a small backyard, to try and link it to other bits of vegetation so it increases the size of the habitat. This could be through corridors of continuous vegetation, or it could be trees that are like stepping stones. One thing that you can use to increase your habitat is talk to your neighbours and maybe get other people to grow local native plants, so the habitat area is much bigger. So that's some of the basics on a wildlife friendly garden. Now for some information on pollinators, I'll hand you over to Kelly.
Hi there. Today I'll be talking to you about how you can attract pollinators to your garden. So establishing a garden with a wide variety of local native plants is a really great way to create habitat for a variety of local wildlife, and particularly for those that will use such a garden as a resource, such as birds, butterflies, bees, wasps, and hoverflies. So these sorts of animals play a really important role as pollinators, assisting in plant reproduction. So for example, as they move from one flower to the next, whilst foraging for nectar and pollen, they essentially fertilise the flower in the process. This flower will then create seeds and fruit necessary for many plants to reproduce. The Adelaide region has a great diversity of these sorts of pollinators. There are around 300 different species of bees, and over the state there are around 78 species of butterfly, with roughly 40 of those often seen within the Adelaide region. So pollination is essential for the reproduction of many of our fruits and vegetables. Roughly 2/3 of all food crops in Australia require some sort of insect pollination. And in fact, many of our native plants can only be pollinated by native bees. Some native bees are really effective pollinators, as they have unique ways of collecting pollen. For example, there are those that are small and can sort of wiggle their way down into small delicate flowers. And then there are those like the blue-banded bee, which perform a special type of buzz pollination, where they use vibrations to collect the pollen. So as these insects play an important role in the food web, not only as pollinators, but as a direct food source for other wildlife, it's really important that we create the right sort of healthy habitat for their ongoing survival. So habitat loss due to vegetation clearance and catastrophic fire events can severely impact the availability of resources for their ongoing survival. Therefore, we can all play a part in providing the right sort of environment to attract pollinators and support the various stages of their life cycle. So how can you attract pollinators to your garden? Well, this will all depend on the type of pollinator you want to attract, as each individual species have different needs. So if you have a particular species in mind, like the blue banded bee for example, it'll really pay to do a little bit of research to work out what their needs are and the particular plants that they are attracted to. But generally speaking, including a wide variety of local native flowering plants with a variety of colours and having a garden which flowers throughout the year will attract a diversity of pollinators. It's also ideal to include a range of food plants like grasses and sedges for caterpillars to feed on and to support the larval development of different pollinators. So as Rob mentioned, a well-designed garden with a wide variety of local native plants in a layered structure will support the other needs of pollinators. So for example, areas to bask, nest, mate, and even for shelter. So including larger shrubs like wattles and native lilac not only provide pollen and nectar, but also provide areas to shelter from the sun and the wind. So rocks positioned in sunny areas provide great spots for insects to bask on, and it's also ideal to have areas of bare ground and dead wood for many different native wasps and bees to nest in. So bee hotels are a great alternative for creating habitat and nesting sites for many different species of wasps and bees. This one here is rather elaborate, but you can create these more simple forms, like this bundled bamboo. But again, different bees and wasps have specific nesting requirements, but there are plenty of resources out there to help you create the perfect habitat. So now that's a bit about pollinators, and now I'll hand over to Steve to talk about frogs.
If you want to attract frogs to your garden, developing a frog pond is a great way to do that. One thing a lot of people don't realise is that frogs actually spend most of the time out of the water. So you need to provide a well-vegetated area to provide shelter for the frogs and also to attract insects and other invertebrates that they will use as a source of food. You need to include physical elements such as logs and rocks, mulch and bark, as well as those flowering plants and ground covers to bring in the invertebrates and to provide plenty of food and refuge spots for those frogs. And physical elements like rocks and logs can be used to create platforms to allow the frogs to move in and out of the water quite easily. Especially young frogs have a lot of difficulty getting out of the water if you've got very steep sides. So developing these ramps and platforms is really important to enable access for those frogs into and out of the water. If you only have plants in and really next to the pond, you're not going to get the frogs hanging around very long, if they come at all. You need to have that well-vegetated garden to provide the buffet for the frogs and to make it an oasis, not a desert. If you don't have this vegetation and you've got just a barren area, the frogs are not going to come, or they're not going to be happy if they are here. It's also important to remember that the pond needs to be shaded, about 2/3 shaded all of the time. It doesn't have to be the same 2/3 shaded. You can have the sun moving over and different parts of the pond being shaded, but if you are in full sun, you are going to get problems with algae and other plant growth. And you also want to make sure it's not completely shaded, because if it is shaded, the water will be very cold, and that causes problems for the developing tadpoles. If the water is really, really cold, those tadpoles are going to develop very, very slowly, and that will also expose them to dangers from predators. So you've got to get that balance between not too hot and sunny and not too cold and shaded. So about 2/3 shaded at all times is the rule of thumb. You also want to be careful about where you position the pond. Don't put it right next to a bedroom window, even your neighbour's bedroom window, because some of these frogs, once they start calling, can be very, very noisy and may keep people awake at night. So position it carefully within your garden. It's also important to make sure you don't position it downhill of a compost heap or other source of nutrients, because that will lead to problems with algae in the water. It's also a really good idea to make sure you've got different depths of water within the pond. So have a shallow area as well as a deep area. And as I mentioned, having ramps or platforms so that the little frogs can get in and out of the water. These different water depths will also help you to have different sorts of plants, so you're not going to get stuck with just one sort of plant, and having the diversity of plants will enable a diversity of insects and other invertebrates. Some people really like to have fountains or cascades in their pond. You can have those without discouraging the frogs too much, as long as the water is not flowing too quickly. If you've got a big raging fountain, that will discourage mosquitoes, but it's also going to discourage the tadpoles as well. So a little trickle of water is good, creates a nice little feature for you, and also helps aerate the water, keep the water nice and fresh. If the water's too fast, you're going to get rid of the frogs and the tadpoles. So you've got to get that balance right. Having a cascade with a shallow pond feeding into a larger pond, as well as looking and sounding great, also provides a nice water source for birds. So they will come and drink and use it as a bird bath. So this pond is not just for frogs, it's for the other wildlife in the garden as well. Having little nooks and crannies in and around the pond provides nice little areas for the frogs to move in and to call from. So some of these little cavities you will find the small frogs move in and call from there, and the cavities act as an echo chamber, boosting their call. So you may find that some of these frogs sound really loud when they're hiding in these little spots. So these provide great little sheltering places where the frogs can call, but also be safe from predators. In terms of pond plants, you want to provide a range of different habitat layers. So you're going to want to have some of the free-floating plants like duckweed, as well as some of the emergent plants. So these are plants like reeds and sedges, which have their roots down at the bottom of the pond. They grow through the pond and then stick up. So these will provide places where the frogs can hide, but also spots where they can attach their eggs. As well as those plants, you want to have some of the submerged ones. They will provide places where the frogs or the tadpoles can hide, and also they'll help aerate the water and act as a source of food. And of course you want to have lots of different plants around the pond to bring in those insects and give the frogs places to hide. So the most important message I'm trying to get across to you is that the pond is not the most important part of the habitat for the frogs. They will use it, but they will spend most of their time out in the garden. So make sure you've got those physical structures for the frogs. Put in a bog garden, have lots of different plants. The frogs will be really happy. They'll move in and provide a great joy for you into the future. Now I'd like to hand back to Jeremy.
Hopefully you've been inspired by a lot of the things that you've seen today and are keen to implement some of these principles in your garden. But where do you start? Well, one of the first things to think about is plant selection. And it's important to understand that selecting local native plants is by far the best option. Now, there are a number of reasons why you would like to select local native plants. Some of them include they're perfectly suited to the local conditions. And by that, I mean things like soil type, the temperature, the amount of rainfall, those kind of things. The other thing is that the animals that you're attracting or trying to attract to your garden have evolved with these local plants. And so by planting the local plants, you're going to have the best success at attracting the local animals. And the final thing to think about is weed issues. Now, if you're bringing in plants from overseas or other parts of Australia, there's a chance that those plants might become weeds in your local community. So by planting local native plants, there's far less likelihood of them becoming weeds. So how do you find out what the local native plants are for your area? Well, we have a number of tools that can help you. Probably the first starting point, or the gold standard I guess, is a tool called Nature Maps. What it is essentially is an interactive map where you can zoom in on where you live and click it and generate a list of native plant species. Another tool we have is the plant selector, where you plug in where you live and it can generate a species list as well. Another great thing about this resource is you can look up information about each of the individual plants. It tells you things like when they flower, what animals they attract, how large they grow, those kind of things. Another resource we have is our Adelaide Planting Guide and also our Coastal Planting Guides. And these booklets have some recommendations around local native species, but also has some information about garden design which you might find useful. So now that you've got your list of local species, the best place to buy them is from a specialist local native plant nursery. To assist you, we've actually generated a list of all the local plant nurseries in the metropolitan area and also the wider regional areas. So certainly download that and have a look where you can purchase your plants. We also have a variety of wildlife specific resources. One of the key ones is our Creating a Wildlife Friendly Gardens booklet. We also have individual fact sheets on particular species of animals, and we have a variety of identification charts. All of these are available via the links below. If you have any questions or would like further advice, use the comments box below to post your question. Hopefully you've found this interesting and have fun creating your wildlife friendly garden.